Mabuhay. Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast with me, Christine. Every 2 weeks, I bring you stories of infamous crimes committed in the Philippines, the country of my mother and where I grew up for most of my life. Before I start today's episode, could I please ask you to follow us on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, and on Facebook, just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Also, if you can, please rate us on Apple Podcasts to help give this little passion project of mine a bit of a boost. Thank you very much. Now to our story. Content warning. This episode contains details of gore and murder, so please take care of yourself whilst listening to this story. Nothing has quite captured the fascination of 90s true crime fans like the Elsa Castillo story. I was too young to even fully understand how such a horrible crime could be committed, and yet one thing was clear to me even then. People are capable of truly hurting someone they purport to love. Like in a lot of true crime stories from the 90s, not much can be found online about Elsa Castillo's life before her untimely death. In a local crime documentary called Crime Classic by Action TV, a woman called Mercedes de los Angeles, who claims to be Elsa's cousin, stated that Elsa was a quiet, joyful, and obedient daughter. She was the youngest of 3 siblings. Mercedes said that Elsa's dream was to have her own family. Not long after college, she met Fred, who would later become her husband. The couple remained childless despite Elsa's dream of becoming a mom. The relationship eventually experienced many difficulties as the couple seemed to be living separate lives after 5 years of being together. Fred was said to be busy hanging out with his friends whilst Elsa enjoyed her job as an assistant personnel manager at Apex Motor Corporation, where she met a young American called Steven Weisenhunt. Eventually, Elsa and Fred separated, and Elsa grew more fond of Steven, who at that point was also still married, but also separated from his wife. Weisenhunt was a manager at Apex Motor Corporation and for all intents and purposes was Elsa's boss. As Steven and Elsa grew closer, the rumor mill at work got louder. Elsa did not really want to deal with the mounting rumors at work, but also wanted to continue seeing Steven, whom she eventually dated. So Elsa resigned from her job at Apex around April 1993. She eventually found a new job, and from the outside it looked like she got what she wanted. She was able to continue dating Steven without having to deal with rumors at work. According to Mercedes, Steven was a very protective, almost controlling boyfriend who made sure, for example, to always pick up Elsa from her new workplace. Mercedes also stated that when asked about her relationship with Steven, Elsa would not say much, and therefore not much was known about the dynamics of their relationship. As you can imagine, with Elsa being rather coy about her relationship with Steven, and the 90s being the last decade without social media, we cannot glean much from the little information that we have about Elsa and Steven. The story of why Elsa had to die or if there were any problems in their relationship will remain a mystery. So in a way, we're left with the story of the star witness, who despite having quite a testimony, could also not give us any insight into Elsa and Steven's relationship before Elsa's death. Again, one has to remember that the version of events of how Elsa's killing came to light is based almost solely on the testimony of Weisenhunt's then driver, Demetrio Ravelo. Strictly speaking, Ravelo was hired by Apex Motor Corporation, but was exclusively assigned to drive around Weisenhunt. This is Ravelo's version of events. Ravelo's testimony starts with the events of the 23rd of September 1993. Ravelo said that he reported to Steven Weisenhunt's condo unit in Green Hills, San Juan, Manila at around 8:30 in the morning. Weisenhunt asked Ravelo to pick up Elsa at her parents' home in Blumentritt, Manila, some 4 kilometers away from where Weissenhunt lived. Ravelo obliged and drove the short distance to fetch Elsa, who was already standing outside waiting for him. According to Ravelo, he next spoke to Elsa at around 2 p.m. when she asked him to drop a paper bag at Weissenhunt's workplace. The paper bag was meant for his colleague Amy Serrano. Ravelo proceeded to drive to Mandaluyong, where Apex was located. After dropping the paper bag for Miss Serrano, Ravelo drove back to Green Hills, where Weissenhunt asked him to stay as he needed him to drive Elsa back to her parents' place at around 10 in the evening. When it got to a little past 10 in the evening, Ravelo told the house helper that he will now be heading home since no one had told him anything about whether Elsa would be going home or not. So he went home and again reported back to work the next day, the 24th of September. He reported back to work at around 8 a.m. Upon arriving, the house helper asked Ravelo if he had seen the kitchen knife, which she said was missing. "No, I have not. I've not taken it," Ravelo said. He then overheard the house helper ask Stephen whether he perhaps had seen the kitchen knife. Stephen Weissenhunt responded that indeed the knife was in his bedroom. Weissenhunt then went back to his bedroom and came back with the lost knife. Both Ravelo and the house helper were dumbfounded as to why Weissenhunt would take the knife to his bedroom, but they did not really make much of it, so they went on with their day. At around 20 minutes to 4 in the afternoon, the house helper asked Ravelo to buy some cigarettes for Weissenhunt. Ravelo went ahead and bought them and drove back to the condo around 5 p.m. He handed the cigarettes over to the house helper. He saw Weissenhunt for a quick minute, who then asked him to leave for the day, so he left. Again, the next day, he reported for work, the 25th of September, around 8 a.m. Ravelo was a bit worried that day. He had been having some problems with regards to his salary payout and asked Weissenhunt if he could quickly pop over to Apex to deal with the payroll department. "Sure," said Weissenhunt. He agreed. So Ravelo went ahead and arrived at Apex. He then met Amy Serrano, the colleague who was given the paper bag 2 days ago. Amy Serrano then asked him if Elsa was still at Weissenhunt's place. Ravelo admitted that even though he did not see Elsa at the condo unit, he still told Serrano that Elsa was still indeed there in Green Hills. Following this conversation, Serrano handed several black plastic bin liners over to Ravelo. It can be assumed that Weissenhunt maybe had called Serrano ahead of Ravelo's arrival and told him to give Ravelo some bin liners. But this was never clear in the court documents, and this is merely my speculation. Ravelo did not really think much of this bin liner situation, so he took them, drove back to the condo unit, and handed over the bin liners to Weissenhunt. Weissenhunt then told Ravelo to drive the house helper back to Cubao, where she lived. Now, Cubao is approximately 5 kilometers away from where Weissenhunt lived. Weissenhunt added that Ravelo should drive to his home, pick up some clothing, and drive back to the condo unit. Weissenhunt told him that they would be going on a trip to Bataan, which is around 150 kilometers west of Manila. Again, this is not an uncommon request from Weissenhunt. So Ravelo did what he needed to do. He dropped off the house helper. He then drove to his home and picked up some clothing. He did not really know how much clothing he should be taking with him because he was not told how long they would be staying in Bataan. So he took just a couple of things. He then drove back to Green Hills at around 10 a.m. Weissenhunt then asked him to check the fuel gauge of the car in preparation for their trip. Weissenhunt also reminded Ravelo to get a gas slip from Apex in order for them to be able to claim their gas costs from the company afterwards. Ravelo did so, run his errands, was done around noon, and ate his lunch. He then proceeded to drive back to Green Hills and stayed at what would then be called the house helper quarters until further instructions came from Weissenhunt. After a little while, and as expected, Weissenhunt indeed looked for Ravelo at the house helper's quarters. He asked Ravelo, just out of the blue, how long he wanted to work for him. The question struck Ravelo as odd, but he nevertheless responded and said that, if possible, he wanted to work for him forever, and that he trusted Weissenhunt fully. Weissenhunt looked like he liked Ravelo's answer, but quickly broke into tears and hugged Ravelo. Ravelo was taken aback. He was shocked by his actions. After Weissenhunt let go of him, he said that he had a problem. "What is it?" Ravelo asked, noticing how stressed Weissenhunt was. "Elsa is dead," Weissenhunt blurted out. Ravelo was shocked and said, "Why did you kill her?" Weissenhunt quickly denied that he killed Elsa and instead told Ravelo that Elsa died in her sleep, or what Filipinos would call bangungot. Ravelo, being the level-headed person that he was, quickly suggested that Weissenhunt should report what happened to Elsa to the police and have her body autopsied, but Weissenhunt did not want to hear any of it. "I already beheaded her," he told Ravelo. What? Ravelo could not believe his ears, but even before he could compose himself, Weissenhunt asked him, oddly enough, if he wanted to see Elsa's decapitated body. Ravelo strongly refused. But Ravelo could not even believe that this was something that Weissenhunt would offer. After a few minutes of awkwardness and wondering what else could be done, Weissenhunt told Ravelo that they needed to drive to the nearest shopping center. So they went. At the shopping center, Weissenhunt purchased a big travel bag with zippers and rollers. Ravelo made an observation in his testimony, saying that Weissenhunt looked rather nervous. His eyes were teary and bloodshot. Ravelo then said that the two men drove back to Green Hills to Weissenhunt's condo. Ravelo then proceeded to help his boss wrap some body parts in the black liners that were handed over to Ravelo by Serrano earlier on. Now, I know I said earlier that we can only speculate as to when exactly Weissenhunt made that call to Serrano, asking her to prepare these bin liners. But I think we can safely assume by now that when Weissenhunt made that call, Elsa was already dead. So, looking at Ravelo's testimony, it can perhaps be assumed safely that Weissenhunt knew exactly what he was doing when he requested for the bin liners. Again, I am speculating, I am assuming. Now back to Ravelo's testimony. Now, remember that when Ravelo was going all through this in Weissenhunt's condo, he had really not seen yet whether the parts belonged to Elsa or not. When he was wrapping those body parts in the bin liners, they were outside of Weissenhunt's bathroom. He was then requested to enter Weissenhunt's bathroom, where he found the dismembered hands, feet, torso, and head of a woman. Ravelo was probably hoping that the body parts did not belong to Elsa, despite maybe feeling that he was indeed dealing with body parts belonging to Elsa. In the bathroom, he then lifted a severed head and was shook to the core when he indeed recognized Elsa's face. He quickly placed the head into a bin liner. The two men then placed the filled-up bin liners into the travel bags and loaded these up into the boot of Weissenhunt's car. Ravelo was then told to start driving to Batangas and Tagaytay, both cities located outside and to the south of Manila. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon at this point. After driving through Batangas and Tagaytay, the two men headed to Santa Rosa, Laguna. Upon reaching the streets of Puting Kahoy and Silangan, Weissenhunt told Ravelo to pull into a narrow road and stop there. Both alighted from the car, and Weissenhunt ordered Ravelo to get the travel bag from the car's boot. Weissenhunt then took the bin liners out of the travel bag and dumped these by the roadside. Hunt then placed the empty travel bag back into the boot and told Ravilo to drive to Bagak, Bataan, where the Hunt family owned a holiday home. It was already 6:30 in the evening at this point, and a further drive to Bataan would mean another 3 hours on the road. On the way to Bataan, Hunt asked Ravilo to stop the car on the top of a bridge. Hunt then ordered Ravilo to alight from the car. Ravilo was then asked to take the travel bag from the boot and throw it into the river. After this, the two men then drove some more, and Ravilo was asked again to stop on top of another bridge and ordered to throw away Elsa's clothing into another river. The two men then continued driving. Ravilo looked over to Hunt and noticed how he was taking something from a bag, which turned out to be Elsa's handbag. He tore what looked like papers into pieces and threw these out of the car window. Elsa's bag was also eventually thrown out as they were approaching Bataan. Hunt at this point then took out a violet and green shirt that seemed wet. He wrung it out and threw it out on a grassy lot. To Ravilo, it seemed that Hunt was trying to get rid of evidence one piece at a time to maybe mislead investigators later on. At last, Hunt and Ravilo arrived at Hunt's beach house at around midnight. Ravilo testified that he was unable to sleep that night as he was terrified of Hunt, who he believed was also capable of killing him being the only witness of what had happened that night. He knew a lot about Elsa's death after all. The next morning, the 26th of September, Ravilo was ordered by Hunt to clean the car's boot and get rid of anything that might cause it to smell. Both men then made their way back to Manila. Along the way, Hunt asked Ravilo to stop. Hunt was observed to take out an ATM card from his pocket, burn the middle of the card, twist it, and throw it out of the window. It can be assumed that the ATM card belonged to Elsa. At last, the pair of them then arrived in Quezon City at around 2:30 in the afternoon. Ravilo was itching to be separated from his boss, so he asked Hunt if he could take the rest of the afternoon off so he can go and be with his family. Hunt surprisingly said yes, and even encouraged Ravilo to take his whole family on vacation. Hunt even handed him a 50 peso note for his commute home. Ravilo left the condo unit in Green Hills and could not go home quick enough. As soon as Ravilo arrived at his home, he told his wife about what had happened to Elsa and what he had experienced with Hunt the last few days. His shocked wife insisted that they report this horrible crime immediately, and Ravilo agreed. The couple reported the crime to the local court's prosecutor known as a fiscal. The fiscal then referred the information to the Department of Justice, who advised him to take the information to the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI. There, Ravilo was finally able to give an official statement on the 27th of September, 1993. The lawyer who dealt with Ravilo and his wife was in complete disbelief. He thought it best to dispatch some NBI agents to Laguna, a province to the south of Manila, to verify Ravilo's story about where Elsa's body parts were disposed of. Upon arriving in Laguna, the NBI agents found a crowd of people gathered around Elsa's mutilated body parts along Road 27. The agents already learned that the local police station had already at this point started their own investigation. The agents then informed Sakaging that Ravilo's statement about the body parts was true. The NBI did not waste any more time and got to working. Together with Ravilo, the NBI agents headed over to Elsa's family home to inform them about their daughter's death. I know what you're thinking. It is highly unorthodox to be taking a potential star witness to the victim's family home. But I think, or at least I can assume, that taking Ravilo with them was a matter of convenience. Ravilo was familiar with Elsa's family. After all, Ravilo had worked for Hunt and had known Elsa for as long as they had been together as a couple. But now back to the story. The NBI agents asked Elsa's two sisters to accompany them to the funeral home where Elsa's body parts were brought to. There, Elsa's sisters identified as much as they could some parts of their sister's body. I can only imagine what a shock to the system this must have been for Elsa's siblings. It is bad enough having to identify a loved one's dead body, but to identify mere body parts is morbid and truly horrifying. The NBI did not waste time and arrested Weissenhunt the next day on the 28th of September 1993. Weissenhunt was informed that as part of his arrest, the NBI will most likely need to take possession of his car. Weissenhunt then asked if he was able to retrieve some personal belongings from within the car to put into the boot. The agents allowed him to do so. Upon opening the boot, the surrounding agents who were eyeing Weissenhunt's moves very carefully had to quickly back away from the car. A foul stench was emanating from the open boot. Furthermore, the agents observed how there were stains in the boot, and they suspected them to be bloodstains. Later on, a forensic technician was then called to collect evidence from the boot and the rest of the car. Meanwhile, Sakaging, the lawyer from the NBI who spoke with Ravelo some days earlier, had also started to interview Weissenhunt on the day of his arrest. Whilst interviewing him, Sakaging noticed contusions on Weissenhunt's lower lip and cheek, which he suspected to be from maybe a struggle with Elsa. In order to follow standard procedure, Sakaging needed to send Weissenhunt to a medical legal officer for medical examination. The medical officer later said that he observed contusions to the abdominal area, right elbow, left and right forearms, and right leg of Weissenhunt. Again, these findings by the medical officer strengthened Sakaging's belief in a struggle between Elsa and Weissenhunt before her murder. Now, as part of NBI procedure as well, Sakaging brought Weissenhunt in front of the Department of Justice for inquest proceedings. Now, in Filipino criminal law, inquest proceedings take a slightly different meaning than in other legal systems, especially the common law systems. An inquest in the Filipino criminal law context is essentially an informal and summary investigation conducted by the public prosecutor in a case involving persons arrested or detained without the benefit of a warrant of arrest issued by the court for the purpose of determining whether said person should remain under custody and correspondingly be later on charged in court. This is usually done in criminal offenses with sentences of 4 years or more. The person leading the inquest, called the inquest prosecutor, will ascertain whether the suspect may be released for further preliminary investigation, and that is usually in cases when there is no probable cause to really hold him. Or B, the inquest prosecutor could order the person to be detained if there is indeed strong evidence against him for the commission of the offense. If the inquest prosecutor chooses the second option, this will then lead to the filing of a complaint or information in court and the application for bail by the suspect's lawyers. However, the suspect will continue to be detained and he will now be officially an accused in a criminal case. Now, even though I am a trained lawyer in England and Wales, but not in the Philippines, I did try as much as possible to understand this part of the revised penal code. Now, as I understand it, instead of waiting for the inquest prosecutor to choose between options A and B, the suspect could just say, hey, I'm going to waive my Article 125 rights and you can start your preliminary investigation right now whilst I remain in detention. And that is exactly what Weissenhunt did. He waived the provisions of Article 125 and the NBI detained him whilst their investigation commenced. Now, if I have any listeners out there who are trained Filipino lawyers, do send me a message, do drop a comment if I'm analyzing this the wrong way, and I will gladly issue a correction to what I just explained. Now back to our story. With the search warrant, the NBI agents searched Weissenhunt's condo the next day, the 29th of September. What have they found? Well, they found bloodstains in the bedroom, specifically on the bedspread and covers. They also found a pair of topsider or boat shoes with bloodstains on them. Furthermore, they also found a bottle of Vicks Formula 44, which is a cough syrup that is known to make a person drowsy. They also found some hair strands on the lampshade in Weissenhunt's bedroom. Whilst the forensic team continued their investigation at the condo unit, another group of agents escorted Ravelo on the road. They wanted to retrace his and Weissenhunt's route to Bataan with the aim of collecting the items that Weissenhunt had disposed of during their journey. The agents were later able to recover a purple-colored bag, a sandal, and a shirt with violet and green florals. All the items were later on identified as Elsa's by Elsa's sister Amelia Santos. Things moved pretty quickly in the NBI's investigative efforts at that point. The NBI's forensic team tested the hair samples from Weissenhunt's condo unit and samples taken from Elsa's remains and found that they matched. Whilst this may sound like a duh moment, since it must have been pretty clear to the NBI at this point that Elsa was murdered inside Weissenhunt's condo, I can only hope to assume that the NBI really wanted this investigation to be absolutely by the book. To this end, the forensic team also tested the blood samples taken from the condo and from Elsa, and both sample groups showed that they are from the blood group B. This is as far as blood sample testing went back in 1993, before the dawn of DNA testing. Finally, the medical legal officer conducted an autopsy on Elsa's remains and concluded that Elsa's immediate cause of death was multiple stab wounds. He was able to determine that Elsa sustained a stab wound to the chest that then punctured her lung. I'm not sure if that was her right lung or her left lung. She also sustained 2 stab wounds under her left breast, which punctured her diaphragm and abdominal cavity and parts of her liver. In the original autopsy report, the medical officer also observed that Elsa's body was in a moderately advanced stage of decomposition by the time that they autopsied her. In the report, they obviously observed that her head was completely decapitated, and that was the truth as well for both her hands. Both her legs and her feet were cut or disarticulated at the joints. It was further observed that all soft tissues of both thighs and her behind were removed, exposing completely the femoral bones and partially the pelvic bone. It was further observed that there was an incised wound at the abdominal area, which resulted in the removal of all organs from the abdominal cavity. The medical examiner further observed that there were multiple contusions on Elsa's face. There was also a 3-centimeter incised wound on her neck, as well as a hematoma on the left side of her head. The medical officer then proceeded to further detail the stab wounds that I have already mentioned earlier. Now, you have to remember that the information that I have given to you were contained in the Supreme Court document that I have used in my research, but they were originally contained in the original medical officer's report that was then presented to Weissenhunt and his lawyer. The NBI wanted him to know what they knew. Essentially, they wanted Weissenhunt to come clean and confess. But instead, Weissenhunt told them a pretty incredible story. So, what did Weissenhunt tell the NBI? According to Weissenhunt, he did not learn about Elsa's death until the 28th of September when he was arrested. He disclosed that on the 23rd of September, he stayed at home as he was feeling poorly. He denied having asked Ravelo to fetch Elsa from her home and having asked him to buy cigarettes. He also denied having instructed Ravelo to go home at 5 p.m. Hunt further stated that he did not see Ravelo at all on the afternoon of the 24th of September 1993. The next day, the 25th of September, Hunt let Ravelo know that he was feeling better and they were leaving for Bataan that afternoon. Hunt then confirmed that they left his condo around 1 in the afternoon and proceeded straight to the family's vacation home in Bataan. Hunt's mother, Nieves Hunt, would later testify in court that her son arrived at their beach house at around 5 p.m. The next morning at around 7 a.m., she said how she saw her son by the beach. She then said that she remembered having lunch with her husband, and they both returned to the beach house around 2 p.m. She learned then that her son had already left before they had arrived. Hunt's aunt also confirmed this in her testimony in court. We will hear from her again later on. To explain the bruises on his body, Hunt explained that when he was in Bataan, he took the opportunity to jet ski, and whilst navigating choppy waters, he lost control of the jet ski, resulting in him sustaining injuries to his chest and legs. He then said that after his beach activities, he went back to the beach house and cleaned up. Later on, whilst descending some stairs at the beach house, he said he slipped and extended his arm to stop his fall. I am assuming that Hunt told the story about his accident by the stairs to explain further why he had contusions on his body. Anyway, Hunt then said that he had lunch and decided to leave Bataan around 1:30 in the afternoon. And this was really the core of Hunt's alibi. He denied having anything to do with Elsa's death as he had no reason to hurt her. He said he loved her. Instead, he claimed that Elsa's estranged husband could be behind her death. Hunt explained that sometime during his relationship with Elsa, he had received 2 letters that were sent to him anonymously. In the first letter, the anonymous sender thanked Hunt for apparently lending him a car and a driver, whilst also cursing him for meddling in other people's businesses and taking something that did not belong to him. In the context of this case, I can only assume that the car and driver were a reference to Hunt's car and Demetrio Ravelo, Hunt's driver, the state's star witness. And the part about meddling in other people's businesses and taking something that did not belong to him was in reference to Elsa. The second letter, according to Hunt, was slightly more violent in nature. It promised revenge and also questioned Hunt's love for his family. Both letters were not deemed convincing by the NBI and later by the court. The court later felt that there was nothing in these letters that could be deemed as exculpatory. Hunt explained that he first ignored the letters but eventually told Elsa about them. Elsa apparently had become very upset upon hearing about the letters, and Hunt claimed that she told him that the letters were from her estranged husband, Fred. To further bolster Hunt's defense, Hunt's aunt, who earlier confirmed Hunt's stay and departure from the family's beach house in Bataan, would further testify that she and her mother visited Hunt at his condo unit on the afternoon of the 23rd of September. She explained that she went into Hunt's bedroom to talk to him. She testified that she did not see anybody else in the bedroom nor in the bathroom. She further testified that the next day, the 24th of September, she again visited her nephew and again had access to both bathroom and bedroom. Again, she stated she saw no one in both rooms. At this point, Ravelo's timeline and the timeline put forward by Hunt's family were very different and was meant to poke holes into Ravelo's testimony as much as possible. The prosecution later on then put forward its other evidence, starting with the blood samples found in the condo bathroom. The defense countered later on in court that Hunt's sister-in-law, who had previously occupied the condo unit 2 years before Hunt moved in, regularly menstruated and may have left her biological sample in the bathroom. She happened to also be of the blood group B, the same blood group as Elsa. The NBI and later on the court obviously did not have time for the defense's Hail Mary explanation and counter arguments of the prosecution's case and evidence. With the NBI closing their investigation and presenting their whole case to the prosecution, the case eventually went to court. But the court, as already hinted so many times in this episode, was not convinced of the defense's explanations. The court, therefore, on the 31st of January 1996, ruled that Weissenhunt was guilty of murder, subsequently sentencing him to life in prison with an additional order to pay criminal damages to the heirs of Elsa and any lawyer fees Elsa's family may have had. These were specifically called actual, moral, and exemplary damages. Naturally, Weissenhunt appealed. He sought to discredit Ravelo's status as the prosecution's star witness and further sought to question the lower court's decision in convicting Weissenhunt solely on Ravelo's testimony. The appeals process lasted a whole 5 years. In 2001, the Supreme Court First Division finally ruled that the trial court had carefully scrutinized and examined the star witness's testimony and rightfully found said testimony to be convincing and consistent on all material points. Ravelo's testimony was corroborated by the physical evidence found by the NBI. The agents found Elsa's mutilated body parts just where Ravelo said they would be. His testimony about Elsa's belongings being tossed out at various points in his journey with Weissenhunt was corroborated by what the agents found on their way to Bataan and back. Ravelo withstood rigorous cross-examination by the defense and was found to be a very credible witness. The court could not find any convincing motive as to why Ravelo would fabricate such an intricate and gruesome story. This is despite attempts by Weissenhunt to paint him as a disgruntled employee who had just been told to resign some time before Elsa's murder. The trial court was also right in pointing out, according to the Supreme Court, that the material evidence alone was damning for Weissenhunt. As the Supreme Court put it, and I quote, "Physical evidence is a mute but eloquent manifestation of the truth, and it ranks high in the hierarchy of trustworthy evidence." End of quote. I think that whilst we lamented the unnecessarily long court process in our last case of the Visconde family, the Supreme Court and the trial court involved in this current case seemed more astute. The Supreme Court made it clear that the, and I quote, "confluence of the testimonial and physical evidence against Weissenhunt creates an unbroken chain of circumstantial evidence that naturally leads to the fair and reasonable conclusion that Weissenhunt was the author of the crime." End of quote. The trial court correctly maintained that the facts are indisputable. Elsa was last seen alive at the condo and was subsequently discovered dead in the condo. The Supreme Court later remarked and reasoned that even the implication that Elsa's estranged husband could have murdered her seemed ridiculous, as it was clear that the murder scene was Weissenhunt's bathroom, and said estranged husband was nowhere near that bathroom. Weissenhunt was therefore correctly convicted of murder beyond a reasonable doubt, and was also correctly sentenced to life in prison according to the Supreme Court. Weissenhunt sat his sentence until 2013 when he was released for good behavior, a decision that feels wholly wrong and tone deaf to Elsa's fate. 2 months after being released, Weissenhunt was then deported back to the US, specifically to the state of California. The trail kind of goes cold here as far as my Googling is concerned. We don't know whether Stephen Weissenhunt is alive or dead. If he is alive, then he surely is living freely and really free of consequences from what he had done to Elsa. I could not find any information about Stephen anymore, but I am assuming that he is now living a normal life, interacting with people who will probably never know what he had done to Elsa and her family almost 30 years ago. I can only hope that Elsa is resting in peace right now, and that thought has somehow sustained the family and provided them with some degree of comfort for the last 27 years. And with this in mind, I want to thank you for listening to our 3rd episode. Please tune in again in 2 weeks for a new episode. Links to the show's resources are found on the show's Instagram page. So just go to Lagim Podcast on Instagram and head to the link in its bio. We are also on Twitter at Lagim Pod, and on Facebook, just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. I recently joined TikTok, and our handle there is at Lagim Podcast, but I'm not quite yet sure what kind of content is really appropriate. But needless to say, I have put in some content in there for your entertainment. Again, if you can, please rate Lagim on Apple Podcasts to give this little passion project of mine a bit of a boost. Thank you for listening. Maraming salamat and mabuhay.